everybody. I'm Mike Bybee. I am here to present, if you were hoping for code samples, anything of the sort, that's not going to be this kind of talk. This is going to be more of a, I guess, an architectural and philosophical discussion. And from my own personal experience of thinking too much inside the Drupal box for solutions that could be often much easier with something else, or just thinking more generally, even if you do end up using a Drupal solution. And we all know that Drupal is capable of amazing things. I've built ERPs with it, LMSs, CRMs, of course, content. I mean, it's. I mentioned a killer feature in my synopsis, and I think maybe it'll be a little surprising to you. I think it's overlooked often in the Drupal world, and in my experience in particular. So this is who I am. I started my own startup. There shouldn't be a space there, and that F should be capitalized. Dang it. But I also work with a couple of other startups in my spare time in various capacities. I've worked with Drupal for about 10 years. Overall, about 19 years of development, primarily JavaScript, some classic ASP and things like that in the dark days. And then I've had to debug some C# code bases that I've never laid eyes on until it broke in production. That was super fun. And then I had backgrounds in design and IT, and they kind of converged for me with development. I started graphic design, doing rave flyers for friends in the early 2000s, menus for local businesses, blah, blah, blah. I've always been a tinkerer with computers. On the personal side, spare time, singer, songwriter, digital musician. That's actually how I got into computers in the first place. My computer science teacher was so awful in high school that I stayed the hell away from them for as long as I possibly could, until, as a kid, just moving out on my own, I ended up selling all my music, or pawning all my music equipment to pay rent, and so I needed a cheaper way to do it. Turns out there's a lot of great free software. That's also what got me into Linux. It was just and open source. It was just, there was so much great free stuff out there. I think I got started with when there was still a free version of Red Hat, as opposed to CentOS or Fedora. Fedora was just a twinkle in Red Hat's eye at that time. But I'm also a coffee dork. Someday, when I retire, I would like to build a Linux-powered and cloud-connected coffee roaster for hobbyists. I'm an avid reader of the classics, Dostoevsky, Victor Hugo, an amateur philosopher. Probably not a very good one, but at least I've gotten a lot better at applying it to my life. And then I use way too many words to say anything whatsoever. I will never be mistaken for terse. I'm an extremely verbose person, and people really hate getting emails or Slack messages from me. So ideal function. Essentially, we build stuff. We're a startup who builds stuff for other startups. Entrepreneurs who have ideas that they don't really have the technical wherewithal or staff or partners to build it themselves. A lot of these entrepreneurs are bootstrapping. So we work to maximize their shoestring budgets when it comes to cloud hosting, when it comes to framework choices, things that a junior developer can pick up easily. We help train those developers and get them up to speed on what we've written so that at some point we can hand it off. Or sometimes we'll take a stake in the company and just basically be an outsourced CTO, and we'll hire on people that still will gradually be full-time employees of that company. Code convergence has been a big thing. It's made our jobs a lot easier and our clients' bills a lot cheaper. That includes things like working with React Native and React Native Web. Given some of the improvements in web view performance, I'm still keeping an eye on Capacitor. I don't work with Ionic, and that's another business decision I've made with junior developers in mind. It's really easy to hire JavaScript developers and train them up. TypeScript is another thing that they have to deal with, and you don't necessarily have to use TypeScript with Ionic, but it's kind of like using Angular without TypeScript. It's just, you can do it, just you miss out on a lot of the ecosystem if you do. And then, like I said, that's all focused on easy handoff when they get to the point where they're hiring devs. So how did this come about? Well, through work experience, but I've noticed things clicking and syncing more and more as things have started to sync up in my life. And basically that's the message overall: simplify. I'm going to share some lyrics here. This is me. This is a message that was inspired by my last girlfriend. We actually, I just ended it because things were starting to get less complicated when you really step back and think about it, the reasons to identify why were very easy. But obviously this is focused on us as a couple, but you can see a lot of that applies to life in general and should apply to work. And I'm going somewhere with this. So that's what really informed, even if we're not together, you set a great template for love, life in general, and work in particular, going forward. So that shifting philosophy, my mindset has been shifting for a couple of years now, really toward this pattern. And that last point there, if it's not easy, is there a dumb complication you can discard? If you think about most of the things that seem unnecessarily complicated in your life, then I think we all know that the answer is there's something dumb holding you up, and you're trying to maneuver around it. Your thinking gets so intertwined with this complication that everything you do gets more and more complicated. It doesn't have to be that way. And so, as that relates to work, like I said, that same quote from the last slide. A lot of people think philosophy is just silly and, college intellectuals and just not a necessary component of your life. The thing is, everybody has a philosophy, whether they know it or not. The more you can identify that and use it as a template for moving to understanding your life and moving forward, dealing with things you encounter in life, integrating it with your life, the easier your life is going to be. And when it comes to planning for your next project or for an existing project, just think ahead about the work you're going to have to do. The more you can plan it in advance, it's like that whole, don't write a single line of code, hopefully until you've written your tests, and don't write those tests until you've really reasoned about what this project is going to need, what your client requirements are, what your available staff is, or talent pool you're able to tap for it. And again, this is how it ties into Drupal. I guess my first year or two with Drupal was very grudging. I mean, granted, this was back in the D5, D6 days, and we know Drupal has gotten much easier to use since then and capable of far more things since then. But then I really started embracing it later on in D6's life cycle, D7, and especially D8. But I found myself starting to, someone would approach me with a problem, and it was just automatically, by default, how can Drupal do this? And I would go down these rabbit holes of, community modules, how many custom modules am I going to have to develop? And a lot of times you end up doing a lot more work than you really need to, thinking like that. Sometimes not, and that's a testament to Drupal's modular nature, is there is so much there API-wise for you to make a simple addition that could solve several problems, but sometimes it works against you as well. So you really need to take that into consideration before you marry whatever technical decisions in a project. What does this have to do with microservices? A couple months ago, GitLab published this article, and it covers the Strangler Method. They're all pretty well-known microservices paradigms. The Strangler Method is basically where you start with a monolith, but you start choking off those features within the monolith and building microservices instead of those features, and integrating them into a larger microservices whole. That is one thing you can definitely do with Drupal. I've done it with progressive decoupling quite a bit, where maybe the project at the time we needed a more responsive UI than Drupal's Ajax could provide, but we weren't ready to go completely headless. So it made more sense to just expose APIs as we needed them, and build, say, a React front end, a Vue front end, whatever, that could simply be loaded up in a very basic Twig template. So from there, you don't have to stick with that progressively decoupled front end. You can, once you've got that API exposed, then you can either take what you've already got or expose more gradually, put it in, have it consumed by a mobile client, a completely separate front end, whatever the case may be. And that, like I said, that fits in, I guess, as a starting point for at least thinking about the Strangler method of adapting to microservices. So from there, once you have parts of that API exposed, then you're thinking, does it make more sense to expose more API within Drupal, or would it be easier to just say, throw up a simple node microservice that could accomplish the same thing? The other, I guess, the major strategy that they cover that ties in with Drupal is the Lego method. And when I go into that what I call the killer feature that's often overlooked, I think that will help. The Lego strategy is more, maybe you start with a monolith knowing you're building microservices around it from the start. Maybe you eventually adopt the Strangler method to start making more of that monolith's features into microservices as well, or maybe it's good enough that you just keep it and you just keep building microservices around it for your whatever iteration of your product. Either way, like I said, it's basically you've got a plan to go with that. And then the other one, I think they call it the nuclear option, is just give up on the monolith, blow it up. I'm not really going to explore that here. Despite my synopsis, I'm not advising you not to use Drupal. I'm not even advising you not to build custom modules. I'm saying that sometimes you may be able to save yourself a lot of work by thinking about it differently. and exploring that other possibility of just building a microservice around your ecosystem instead. So here we are, the often overlooked feature, and I've dealt with this a lot with startups, and I keep coming back to Drupal, whether it's for just getting to MVP or all the way to a market-ready product, and that's user management. Drupal really excels at user management. You shouldn't reinvent the wheel if at all possible. And maybe it seems like overkill to use something like Drupal just for its user management. The thing is, you don't have to activate all those features. But the user part is there by default. And it can save you a lot of time. And that's what I've discovered working with startups is a lot of the ideas for apps. And you can test this, just look around the Play Store and try, or the App Store, and try to reason about what it is going on. You don't have to see their source code. You can figure out that a lot of these things are centered around the user object. Some of the startups I've worked with for employee rewards, for example, I mean, that's all based on a user. Whether it's the employee themselves, the customer giving them feedback, the manager evaluating those positive reviews, corporate ranking stores against each other, it's all centered around the user. And there are countless other examples like that. And what makes the user what makes the user management so good in Drupal is just the way you can customize fields. Roles and permissions are, I guess maybe when you're very new to it, they can be daunting. But I think, in my experience and that of most people I've talked to, once you get the hang of the roles and permissions in Drupal, it's just a breeze to figure out who needs to have what, and just go from there. And then there are things like social auth. Now, technically, in a microservices architecture, you should have separate authentication, authorization. But again, especially when we're talking about getting to MVP for a startup, it really helps to have some of this baked in with Drupal's social API and social auth module and submodules. It's really nice to have that out of the box instead of maybe, if you were doing this with Node.js, people would probably go, and this is available in Drupal 2, auth 0. Or people might go with Passport if they want something totally open source, or Okta, another one that's available in Drupal. But it's, like I said, it's easy. Make your life simple. Don't give yourself more work than you need. Let's see. So getting Drupal to work with microservices, it's far from perfect, but I think Contenta.js gives a pretty good template of what's possible by putting a gateway in front of Drupal. Allowing you to customize routes and what routes are available from the Drupal instance. Because it's just Node and Express, you can add other Express middleware to it. Maybe at some point you decide, okay, it's cool that it consumes JSON API from Drupal, but I want my front end to consume GraphQL. I'll just throw in Apollo Server or whatever into what's already built there with Contenta.js, and you're still following basically an API gateway pattern. Or maybe you're using something, Amazon or some other gateway. But that ties into the next point. Like I said, with Contenta.js, you can limit your routes and customize your routes that are exposed by the in the Drupal instance. The unused ones shouldn't be exposed. That's just an unnecessary security risk. So that having that gateway pattern fits really well in a larger microservices picture. If you still need to do some, maybe maybe you don't have a flat level of microservices behind that gateway. Maybe you need something that Drupal needs to consume from another API, massage it, and integrate it with the API that it's producing. Guzzle works well for that. Again, now you are getting into developing custom modules, usually, if you're turning to Guzzle with Drupal, but they can generally be pretty simple consumers that are, like I said, just turning it into a format that's more easily produced by Drupal. Oh, that's not good. Okay, it looks like I'm missing the rest of my slides. But I guess from here, let's just go to the front. So, what I said at first, stop building modules. Sometimes you come to a point where maybe you need to think about whether you even need Drupal at all. On a recent project, I really wanted to include Drupal in it, but the user management wasn't, the user object that I was dealing with wasn't really a big enough, complicated enough entity that it would justify it. And I very quickly realized that in this particular app, offline first functionality was going to be one of the major factors. And while I decided on CouchDB and CouchDB, more specifically RxDB, which is just CouchDB with RxJS observables. Works really well in a view-based front end, whether it's Vue, Vue, React, whatever, because essentially you're just pushing data to your local Pouch instance. And if there is any, it's synchronizing in the background. One nice thing about RxDB that really doesn't have anything to do with either of those technologies, but one of the options they have is GraphQL synchronization. If you've ever worked with CouchDB or relaxed web services in Drupal, you know that the CouchDB protocol is very chatty over its REST API. With GraphQL, you trim that down a lot. Essentially you're just putting a GraphQL gateway on the server side and then getting that to synchronize the data with CouchDB. I really thought about using Drupal in this case, with relaxed web services. I tried to reason about how it might make sense just in case I needed more content management functionality or user management functionality down the road, and I just couldn't justify it in this particular project. Now I have, like I said, used Drupal over and over again, even if only for the user management. With a couple of LMSs I built, Drupal was the natural choice, no matter how much I built outside of Drupal for the rest of it, because H5P is just so good. But in this case, like I said, I could not justify it. It wasn't simple enough, and it was easy enough to build. Honestly, CouchDB, if you've worked with it, a lot of times it can handle just about everything when it comes to being your API server. You have to learn how it handles permissions and security, because it's a much different model than you're probably used to, especially working in the PHP MySQL world versus NoSQL, and more and more often you're seeing the one database per user pattern in CouchDB. I didn't actually go with that because I needed to have shared documents and didn't want to fiddle all day with CouchDB's MapReduce functionality. Again, keeping it simple, it was something that was more easily achieved at the gateway level for me. So these are all things that you need to factor in. But again, at the end of the day, this should be your philosophy for just about everything you do. Like I said, if it's getting complicated, think about why. And the more you can think about how your decisions are going to, what potential complications those may introduce in the long term, the easier you learn to reason about your work and plan for it in advance, and make it much simpler as you go along. And I think that's just about it. So let's see. Yeah, well, we've got quite a bit of time. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah. I wanted to keep this.
So is CouchDB mostly for offline apps? Still a little bit new to it.
CouchDB itself is a server-side NoSQL database. You don't hear about it quite as much anymore. Things like Mongo have kind of taken over recognition-wise. CouchDB is, I guess, the most famous implementation of it now is IBM's Cloudant. There used to be a company called, I don't know exactly what their status is. I know they're not a big player anymore, but there was one called Couchbase that combined two databases. I can't remember what the other one is now with CouchDB, but it's compatible with the CouchDB API. But it is essentially just a NoSQL database with a RESTful API that is heavily focused on replication. And it has a master-master sync philosophy. So it's, I guess the model that it goes by is eventual consistency, and it handles things by revisions. And you definitely need to read up on its quirks, because with all of those revisions, your databases can get pretty huge pretty fast, but it has trim functionality, truncating to whatever level of revisions you want. And then there are some ways I had to work around their revision functionality to get multiple users to be able to collaborate on documents, let the owner of the document have the final say, instead of just having their changes overwritten, not having a chance to approve, things like that. But it's pretty impressive, nonetheless, in the way that it just, here's an API, and whatever document you're pulling or creating, the way it handles that. On the client side, that's where CouchDB comes in. And it has lots of different storage mechanisms. Typically in the browser, it's storing to either memory, an in-memory cache, or IndexedDB is the recommended way to go. For things like React Native, it actually uses a SQLite 3 backend, but it stores it as JSON, as opposed to typical binary. Let's see, and it just it has ways to just automatically synchronize, both pushing and pulling to that CouchDB instance. And the same with when you're scaling up multiple CouchDB instances. It's a pretty set, not set and forget, but there are some automatic change listening, synchronization steps that you can take with that. So a lot of it gets handled on its own. At that point, like I said, really all you need to worry about is your permissions, your database size, and keeping those truncated, and just the throughput of the protocol. If depending on your host and how you have it configured, yeah, you may run up some pretty high ingress and egress charges. But like I said, RxDB for me has been a great solution for that, just running it through a single GraphQL replication endpoint. And with the RxDB server side instance of that, it's basically running, I guess, Pouch server as a gateway in front of the CouchDB instance, and then you just tell it how much less it should be replicating as being sent over that GraphQL API instead of just multiple reaches out to an endpoint, worrying about a WebSocket or something like that. But yeah, it's like I said, people don't really. I guess that it was probably a lot bigger back as far back as like 2010. There was a little bit of buzz around it again. I'd say probably around 2016 or so. But I've seen enough projects with it where it just, if you really need that offline first functionality, Pouch and Couch is a really tough combo to beat. And like I said, with Drupal, you have the relaxed web services module that uses at least the parts of the CouchDB API. It's not fully API compliant, but usually what relaxed is used for is content migration, content staging, moderation, things like that. Like I said, I really wanted to find a way for it to work, and maybe when I'm done, this is totally done, it'll be that aha moment, I could have done this. We all have that, but for me, it seemed easier to just go with actual Couch, and instead of trying to make Drupal more Couch-y, I guess. Like I said, trying to think about Drupal-y people doing Drupal-y things. Don't get Drupal to do non-Drupal-y things, if it doesn't make sense. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of people just get married to one platform,
sure,
and then they try to bend it to something that's not, or it's never really meant to do something.
Yeah, I'm definitely very opinionated myself. I have committed pretty heavily to React in the front end wars. I know Angular is much better than it used to be, but I went through enough of those Angular 1 to Angular 2 nightmares, and just Angular 1, Angular JS nightmares in general of that two-way data flow and trying to debug that, which is one of the main inspirations for React coming about. It's just, no, this is madness, let's keep it one way. But I mean, I know, obviously, like I said, I'm working with RxJS now, with RxDB, so I know there are a lot of great features baked into Angular, but I'm still kind of cringy because of my past experience. I like Vue, but it's just so boilerplatey. And I think from what I've been reading, version 3 has improved a lot of that, but I haven't had time to mess with it. And like I said, for me, a big thing is converged code base. On this project, I would say it was over 95% single code base for web, mobile on Android and React, and they only really have a need for Windows and Mac, but using Electron, you get a free Linux client too, just for the one weirdo like me who uses Linux. But 95% of it was just React, and then on the web and Electron side, doing a couple of a couple of Babel redirects to React Native Web when it was calling React Native imports in a project. And that project has come a long way from where it started. If you do work with React and React Native, I highly recommend taking a look at React Native Web. I used to think that React XP was going to win out, which is Microsoft's similar project, but I think that React Native Web has pulled way ahead on that front. I actually had another presentation that didn't make the official lineup, but it was talking about my Pouch and Couch combo and kind of the mini framework that I built around that, or mini library I built around that for state management in React, and with the main objective there being obviously persistence. And just because I wanted to be, the next genius who created another state management library that wasn't Redux. And I'm a big fan of Redux. I am not a big fan of its boilerplate, but I would say that's another decision that you have to make architecturally. A lot of times it still makes a lot of sense to use Redux, but especially if you're going to be working with junior devs and you feel like you do have to use Redux, I would recommend taking a look at something like Easy Peasy, which is just a wrapper around Redux. It actually integrates Emmer, which is fantastic for immutable state as well, and just makes it really easy to use without all that mind-numbing boilerplate that you're used to with Redux.
Well, I mean, I'm still kind of trying to wrap my mind around Redux, the actions and the reducers and everything.
Yeah.
I'm mostly front end.
And thunk. What in the world is a thunk? I mean, it's.
But I think the latest version of React is trying to fix a lot of the things that Redux was originally trying to fix. It's kind of nice.
I'm totally in love with hooks.
Hooks. That was really
if I never have to write another class again, and that's funny, probably to a bunch of PHP people, you know. Classes, you know, I'm sure we've all heard the whole syntactic sugar comment about JavaScript classes 1,000 times, but it's true. And classes are just, you know, that I guess that's one reason as long as I've been working with Drupal, I guess I can go ahead and shut this off, right? I think that I've always had a kind of a burning hatred of classes. I think, you know, as much as a lot of the hard developers badmouth JavaScript, one, I think it's kind of like the way people badmouth PHP.